podcast once again. Hello.
It doesn't seem like it both seems like a really long time since we did this and no time at all. I've kind of lost track.
Yeah,
I don't know.
That's because you have COVID.
That's
you're falling back into
yeah.
you're falling back into the time has no meaning phase of
Time has
the
no
last
meaning.
3 years.
Yes. Is it the year 2000 all over? And is it 2020 again, or is it the year 2003 again? I don't know.
Yeah, is it lockdown or is it like my heavy new atheist kind of days? Yeah, what are you gonna do, Dan? For the listener, Dan and I were just reminiscing,
musing
about. I also have a cough. I don't know what's going on. Hopefully, I don't also have COVID. Let me just say up front, we're going to do
COVID. Yeah. I mean, I don't actually have a cough. So.
Well, yeah. I'll try and go to your relation.
Yeah.
We're going to be doing our best to get through this one, is I suppose what I'm saying.
Yeah.
What was I going to say? We were just reminiscing right before we hit record about. We'll get to what we read here in a second, but the author for this week's episode, whose name I believe is actually pronounced Gilbert Achcar. Achcar, I think. I said it to myself a million times and now I already forget. Anyways, I looked him up in interviews with him to try and figure out how to say his name, and now I've just completely forgotten. But one of those interviews was a very recent interview on Democracy Now! And we were just saying that, that just takes you back to a different time. Like Amy Goodman, I think is her name. I was just like, there she is. She's still there. Still has been doing it all this time. Exactly. Yeah. Noam Chomsky's just like a pile of jelly. It's just like, Noam, what do you think? Yeah. What are you gonna do? Occupy. Back when I had my mind blown by Occupy. Different times. It actually probably was when I was like going to bookstores and being like, Noam Chomsky. Pretty crazy stuff. Yeah. Anyways, these days I go to the bookstore and I told you about this, I think last week. I went to the bookstore and they had 2 copies of EndNotes, and it was like a jump scare. I was like, wow, what is that doing outside of like my like small sphere of like things that I talk about?
Yeah. Like maybe you're having some kind of paranoid breakdown where you think copies of EndNotes are following you.
Exactly. It's funny because I own 2 copies of EndNotes. It's 1 and it's 5, and those are the only copies that are there. I was just like, well, someone's messing with me. And they were there like 3 weeks ago and they haven't been sold. I'm just like, someone's really messing
it's
with
even
me
worse,
right now.
isn't it?
Yeah,
Nobody wants them. Did you go and buy them and like give them to a stranger or something?
Yeah, that's a good idea. How to alienate myself.
Yeah. Or next time somebody from the IMT is tabling in the street. I don't know.
Be like, have you read EndNotes? Actually, yeah. Well, couldn't hurt.
It's an option. I'm just saying it. It's an option.
It is an option, yeah. What are you going to do? Only other thing I wanted to mention before you get started, Dan, is I had a very interesting experience of people have been talking about recently. I guess the king of this country gave a speech recently, and one of the everyone's like, he was talking about the cost of living, literally sitting in a chair made of gold, and everyone's just like dunking on him for it because it's so patently absurd. And I was thinking, somebody said to me, they were like, this must be especially weird for you because you're from America where this stuff doesn't happen. And I had to like lecture them about how Trump literally has a toilet made of gold and like the most garish penthouse in New York. But this is a very banal observation, but I was just like, at least in America, it's like people are under the impression that they can pull themselves up by the bootstraps and get to that point. But it's just like, England is so funny because he's literally sitting there being like, you will never have this because you weren't born into the right family. It's so funny. And people go, it's just, oh God, I love it. I love this country. It's so good. Just another wrinkle. It's just like, man, hilarious.
Yeah, even I sort of accept it, like, not that I'm uncritical of it.
It's a thing.
Though. But obviously I'm critical of it, but I accept it as a thing,
Yeah.
Whereas maybe what it deserves is just like incredulity, I suppose. Just like,
yeah, I guess. What are you gonna do though? It's like, yeah, he's just sticking his nose at us because it was that. It wasn't like he was. I didn't get the impression that he was out of touch. I got the impression that he was just like, fuck you. You know what I mean? Just like, I don't know. Elizabeth would have never, Dan.
Well, I don't know how. Yeah, what I was just thinking was, how did she get away with it for so long?
I don't know.
Like, I don't know.
Do they get away with it? What am I going to do?
Maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe not. Or maybe she'd just been there so long that there was a sort of inertia behind her, whereas now Charles is there and everybody's reconsidering what the hell is going on.
Reconsidering. Yeah. I'm reconsidering having a monarch.
I mean, the narrative that I sort of like absorbed was one where, well, what happens is the government writes a speech and then gives it to the king, and the king reads it out.
Oh,
so it's like it's the state opening of Parliament. The king reads a speech, all about the legislation that his government are going to enact in the next year. But it's a speech that's just written by Rishi Sunak's speechwriters, I suppose. So, yeah, I don't know.
Well,
I often have to fight back a degree of sympathy for the royals.
Wow.
Yeah,
they have it rough.
Well, they're just sort of, anyway. I don't know. Yeah, it's just sort of bad. They're just sort of like they're very wealthy, unfortunate victims of circumstance, the same as the rest of us. But I suppose we're all it's just there. Yeah.
Who was the prime minister though? Relatively recently, there was a prime minister in Australia who I should look him up, but I'm not going to. Do it yourself, listener. Who was deposed in a constitutional crisis. It was a Labour guy, and he was deposed basically by the English monarch, by Elizabeth, because there's like a post in Australia that's supposedly a ceremonial post, but it's just like the monarch's governor or some bullshit, and he has to like approve in a ceremony the PM. I forget the guy's name, but one of them got deposed then, and I had never really taken seriously the whole, well, the monarchs, they do actually have some power, it's just sat in reserve for if they ever need to do it. I was like, do they? I don't know. They just kind of sit there and, be disgusting. But it's like, oh, I guess they do actually. And sometimes it gets used. Like, not great.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that case. It does raise the question for me. Like, I sort of understand why we hold on to this stupid anachronism, but why does anybody who was a colonial subject of ours carry it on?
Well, we'll see. What are you gonna do? It is funny. Being from America, it's very funny, and I appreciate that aspect of it all. But
what are you gonna do?
Okay, Dan, we've had our preamble. Should we get into what we read?
Yeah. Why don't you tell me? Pretend I don't know.
We reread Gilbert Achcar's essay, Religion.
I like how you've put a lot of effort into trying to learn how to pronounce his name, and it didn't even occur to me that maybe that's something I should do.
Well, I had no idea. I was like, oh, Gilbert, and then I was like, I just need to know the last name, and then they were like Gilbert, and I was like, come on. What are you going to do?
This is going to be an episode where I just refer to the author as the author all the way through.
Yes, me too. Yes. Yeah. For now on, the author said this. The author. Anyway, so the author wrote a piece in a magazine, The Socialist Register, in 2008. We're keeping up on the times here, hence why I was like watching Democracy Now! Earlier. Essay called Religion and Politics Today from a Marxian Perspective. And well, it is what it is. It's trying to crumb up with like a comparative sociology for religion. I wanted to ask you, though, before we started, you had been talking about wanting to read something about religion and Marxism for kind of like a little while. It wasn't like you weren't like, come on, let's read. I want to do religion.
Like chomping at the bit, like
exactly.
Desperate.
I'm not trying to imply that. No. But you were interested in it, and I'm interested to know why, because it's not something that I've really, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure whether it's a specific desire to sort of combine an understanding of Marxism and an understanding of religion. I think more it's perhaps a general desire to develop and reinterpret my understanding of religion, and I suppose what it means in a social context, in a historical context, and how to think about it theoretically. And obviously, my first point of call with theory is is Marxism, I guess. So that's where the connection is. I mean, I guess a little bit of personal biography that I, like most of us, I suppose, was quite an adherent of sort of the sort of new atheist movement at an age when that was appropriate.
Yeah.
I mean, an age for myself when that was appropriate, and also during an age,
Yeah.
a period of the modern age where that was appropriate as well. And then have subsequently come to sort of soften in my stance. I mean, I haven't sort of developed any particularly strong religious leanings, but have come to be more sympathetic toward it and want to understand the place that it holds both in the world and for specific believers, both communities and individuals. Yeah.
I'm correct in saying that neither of us have any background in religion, right?
No.
Yeah, so we're the most qualified people to talk about.
I mean, the same as we have no particular background in anything that we talk about.
Yeah, exactly. I was listening to an episode of Andrew Kleiman's podcast, Radio Free Humanity, today, and the title of it was basically like the politics of basically the politics of transphobia and trying to track where that has come from in the United States. And I was like, oh, this sounds really fascinating. I turned it on, and the first thing they all said, it was four straight guys, and they're all just like, so yeah, just up front, we are just like four cis guys talking about trans rights. That's pretty much what we're doing here. I don't know really anything about religion. I've never really had any background in it, but I'm going to take on the appropriation.
But if you acknowledge it ahead of time, it's fine.
Yeah,
right?
It's fine. It's fine. Yeah, exactly. Yes, I think much like you, I think we probably have had very similar backgrounds in this. I went to church once when I was visiting family in Australia when I was like 7, because they always go on Christmas, I guess, and I had to go, and it's the one time I've been, and they literally made me and my brother go before we opened presents, which was like the most fascist thing on the planet, hence why I've never been back to church. So yeah, I don't really have any personal connection to it. Again, like you, I definitely had a religion is, the worst thing on the planet. It's the cause of all of these evils, new atheist phase, at a time when it was appropriate to have that. And now I think I've very much just come around to like, I don't really care. You know what I mean? Like if somebody, like obviously the world's religions, especially, like the Catholic Church, and like we'll get into kind of like Islamic fundamentalism as well, have been responsible for just like obscene horrors, but also like, what are you going to do? Hassle somebody for being religious? You know what I'm saying? I think I'm well past that. So I did appreciate this. This was kind of not quite what I thought it was going to be. I was kind of expecting it to just be like, religion from a Marxist perspective and tell me everything I should know. Gilbert, please, enlighten me, just bestow upon me this knowledge. And it's interesting. It's basically, well, we'll get into it. It begins with a really interesting story of his, like a personal story about when he was growing up in Lebanon in high school and how he was like ultra Marxist positivist guy, right? And about how he was like, the revolution is going to usher in this great material abundance for everybody. And he tells this story about how he had this really cool high school history teacher who they'd always talk shit about, like, I can't wait for, the revolution, Russian Revolution is so great. One day it's going to happen all over the world. This is in like the 60s, right? And I guess one day they had a discussion about religion, and the author was like, I'm an atheist. Marxism and religion, incompatible. That shit's so stupid. In the 21st century, when we get like mass material abundance and everybody is able to do what they want, there's going to be no religion. And then he said that his like supposedly cool history teacher was like, well, alternatively, what about if material abundance and like fulfillment ushered in an age of like, real spiritual introspection? And that just like completely threw him for a loop. He's like, what are you talking about? How could that possibly happen? And so I guess that's kind of his way of saying, this is how he got interested in studying religion, and specifically about what Marx and Engels both had to say about religion. And then also the way he kind of frames the rest of this essay is, now we're in the 21st century. Not only do we not have socialism, we have like mass, poverty around the world. And that actually this has led to a huge ideological regression in terms of religion. So yeah, it's an interesting way of framing it. I was kind of hoping that he would come around to that question more about like, will socialism make people more spiritual in the broadest sense of the word? He doesn't. He just kind of touches on it, but it's still an interesting essay.
Yeah, it's a really interesting um, uh, uh, proposition, I suppose. And in some ways, it does stem from what he describes as Marx's approach to analyzing religion as a social phenomena, um, and sort of like the degree of detail he goes into around um, what Marx. This classic story, I suppose, of what Marx takes from Feuerbach and then what Marx adds to that. Um, and I think a lot of that is can also you could use that description of Marx as a jumping off point for a reconsideration of the role that religion fills um, in human beings' sort of social psychological existence, and the question of what that could be under communism, I suppose. And I think contra Feuerbach um, and contra the author's youthful position, and also contra you and I's early atheism.
Thanks for putting us in the same group there.
Contra all of that, um, a I think a sort of probably a properly socialist position reflection, socialist by which I mean under socialism, position and reflection upon and toward religion probably isn't going to be a sort of dogmatic, positivistic, um, scientistic worship of atheism from the perspective of being intellectually superior, being of the Enlightenment, um, and I guess I would propose and wager that those things are actually synonymous with the neoliberal age in which we live. And when those ideas were triumphant, it was also at the point of neoliberalism's triumph.
Yeah, I think he's basically just saying socialism will probably not be Stalinist state imposed atheism.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing, right?
Yeah.
Because he's basically saying, in fact, people have lost the ability to worship as they want. And he's like, obviously, socialism is going to let you do that. You're going to be able to do whatever you want. I mean, I think if we think about, I don't know. I mean, I haven't thought nearly enough about this, but I think that like there's probably a distinction to be made between lower and higher stages of communism as it relates to religion. None of this is in the essay, but I think it's interesting to think about just in terms of like there will still be those like birth pangs of there will still be like organized religion, but they're going to be able to just kind of do whatever they want, and it'll probably slowly decay and evolve into just like if you still want to worship something, then it will probably just be your thing or your community's thing. It won't be this thing that's imposed upon you by above. But my understanding of it all, or at least the way I think about it in terms of like religion as such or spirituality and higher stage communism, it makes me think back to the Nadrata essay that we read about, you know, Marxism or Marxist thought and Native American philosophy, just in terms of like a complete reimagining of what it actually means to be spiritual. Because like the kind of settler imagination of what Native American religion or its spirituality, quote unquote, is like so off the mark. You know, it's like, oh, you know, wow, these brave people who worship the land and they worship the buffalo. It's like it's just basically just racism is what it is. But in reality, like what it is it's kind of just like what I think what was his name? Glenn Sean Coulthard, I think is his name, called grounded normativity, which is just like kind of what we think about when we think about ecology. It's like imagining and recognizing yourself in the web of life and kind of living your life like you exist within a broader web of life. And that's kind of what is known as spirituality. So I'm not saying that that's what religion or spirituality will be like under socialism. It could very well be. But I think that it's interesting to think about the historically specific nature of what it means to be spiritual or religious has been completely changed throughout time. And it's very historically specific and contingent. And like, yeah, if you were to consider like pre, you know, kind of like agricultural forms of worship spiritual, it's completely different than what it means now. And there's probably going to be some kind of paradigm shift as well when it comes to spirituality for socialism.
I suppose it's perhaps worth my saying that um, when I'm thinking about religion, there's a degree to which the form that I'm fixating on is I suppose, like a form of Christianity which is orientated toward the community of worship and the community of believers. And I think there's a danger, before we get into this, there's a danger of my focusing on that aspect of religion, and not sort of like opening it up to the sort of like full pantheon of possibilities that phrase could encompass and mean. So, a little bit sort of like personal admitting of biases to begin with.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think that probably gets us into what Marx actually said,
Yeah.
right? In the introduction to his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right? This is the thing that's always cited by Marxists and atheists and like armchair kind of like sued assholes, right? It's like, it's the line about religion being the opium of the masses, which is constantly misconstrued and misapplied, right? Um, and it's basically this idea of Marx just saying, sure, criticize religion if you want to for these kind of like, um, you know, for making people resign to suffering, for organizing their kind of like complacency, and for being just kind of fucked up in general. You know what I mean? Thinking about like the different forms of domination that have taken place in the Catholic Church, for example. But like, he's also saying that you can't stop there. Like a criticism, it's the famous line that he has about the criticism of heaven has to inevitably turn into a criticism of the earth. Because as we were just saying, like organized religion, and much like humans, don't just sit outside as an abstract entity of the rest of the world and the rest of human systems and are just their own things that are formed by themselves, right? Like they're formed by society and by the state. And it's a very like, much like most of Marxist thoughts, it's like a very systems theory based kind of understanding of human society. And it is like, the criticism of heaven, criticism of religion has to turn into a criticism of the society that religion is born into. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to understand it. Like, why was the early Christian church sects of like really early communal Christianity so based on community and communalism and stuff like that, versus why do people in like, I don't know, Missouri or some state like have crazy evangelical churches? Not trying to throw shade at Missouri. Missouri is cool, but like, you know what I mean? Like these things are very contingent on the societies that they live in. And Marx is, making the criticism that you can't just abstract religion away from the rest of human society.
Yeah, I think there's an approach to the idea of religion being an opiate that can be, you can come at it from two angles, right? Like there's the aspect of religion which is being proposed to be stupefying. It's sort of like false consciousness. It's something that purely needs to be overcome. It's something that's to be criticized intellectually. I feel like that's the sort of like new atheist attack, right? Is a kind of like, this is really stupid. This is really backwards. This is something that's to be overcome and left in the past. And as I understand it, that's the crux of what Feuerbach's doing, and what Marx is criticizing him for is saying, well, it's not just that you should criticize religion, but in tandem with that, you need to have a sort of thorough critique of society. And so it's not just that religion is keeping people stupid, but also it's giving them something that's very necessary. And you have to look to what is necessary for people in their worship, and wonder how that can be. Well, the question it brings up about for me is, okay, what would we construct in our socialist society that would be a replacement for that? And it might entail something of a Enlightenment style overcoming of mysticism and understanding of sort of like a different, more scientific understanding of the world. But it won't entail a sort of like ruthless critique of the stupidity of individuals, but rather a creation of a different way of living communally and understanding the world as something which is collective but connected and I don't know, like can be explained in a different way, but in a way which has a collective narrative, I suppose, as opposed to an individualistic one.
Yeah, and at its worst, well, I guess at its worst, that kind of like individualist kind of style of religion obviously has its, kind of like manifestation as like interreligious conflicts, which are obviously, again, you need to like criticize Earth and see where these conflicts are coming from. But just on like a concrete interpersonal level, you might have somebody that's like, oh, you're from the New Presbyterian Church of South Poughkeepsie. I'm from the New Presbyterian Church of, West Manicopa or something like that. Like, you asshole,
New
die.
Haverbrook.
But exactly.
Sorry.
But it's also like, as you're saying, the like atheist, I sit above the world and I look down upon you simpletons for your communities. When it's like oftentimes it's just people like going to church on a Sunday and just like hanging out and enjoying themselves. You know what I mean? Not to say that's like the norm, but and then you can also have like the kind of atheist, like I remember Sam Harris wrote, this was one of the first times I was like, well, maybe there's something weird going on with these new atheists. Cause he wrote like a very infamous article where he was like, perhaps a preemptive nuclear strike against the Islamic world is justified because the West has, had its enlightenment and we're much smarter. It's like, oh, this isn't fun anymore. This seems kind of fucked up. But I will say so then the author makes a really interesting point where he's basically like, you need to consider exactly as you're saying, like the kind of resignation that religion offers to people to their suffering. But you need to also like, what is the phrase Marx says? He says it's a expression of real suffering, but it's also its protest. And the author actually kind of criticizes Marx a little bit for not expanding on that second part of it, not saying that it actually can be a real protest against real suffering. And then he has a very funny phrase where he's like, if Marx had expanded on it, the famous phrase probably would have been, religion is the opium and the cocaine of the masses. Which did you happen to read the footnote for that paragraph? He was like, oh, I consulted with a medical doctor friend of mine to see what a drug would be.
My friend told me what
exactly that would excite the central nervous system. I was like, this guy's an asshole. But I think the point is well made, though, right? It's like you can easily look to history, and even now, to see forms of religion that, not in the best way, but are organizations for a type of progress. And he kind of tries to show the two different types of religion, the opium at its worst and the cocaine at its maybe close to best that we've had in the last century, in studying the two that he puts forward here for kind of a comparative critique of religion, which is Islamic fundamentalism, kind of from the 1970s on, and Latin American liberation theology. Although when he talks about liberation, he's like, now I will discuss liberation theology. And then he spends the entire time talking about German peasants and then doesn't mention liberation theology.
Yeah.
Like, okay.
I thought they were going to be his two cases, right? And he sort of proposes it like that. But in some ways, that's actually to the virtue of this text, and it makes it more readable now, in that, sort of contrary to the way we're presenting it, it isn't necessarily stuck in the debates of the early 2000s. I think it is a very historical and theoretical text, and it's not focused on cases that are in some ways irrelevant to the world that we live in now. But yeah, certainly those are the two cases that he presents, and I don't know about you, I did have some difficulty in trying to work out whether I accepted the arguments that he was making or not, and we'll get into those in a minute, I suppose. As I was reflecting on it before we started, I sort of feel like what he's actually doing is quite a laudable kind of historical materialism, I suppose, where he's both outlining how certain historical facts about the origins and development of, in this case, Christianity and Islam in their sort of like world historical forms, I guess. Although he does reference certain other religions as well, and sort of describes a more historical materialist understanding of their origins and how their origins affected their historical appearance and development in the world. But I feel like he's treading a tightrope, which I think he does quite well, where he's both not saying that history in the context of these two world religions is fully deterministic of their social and political qualities, I guess, but it is in some ways, it contributes quite heavily to how they appear in the world, I guess, if that makes sense. And so there's the fact that he's seeming to make certain somewhat sweeping statements about particularly the historical origins of Islam and how they contribute toward a degree of affinity with sort of reactionary politics is a troubling proposition when you read it, and one that one might naturally want to be repelled by. But I think he's clearly not being prejudicial in his attacks, but rather just descriptive.
Yeah, I was kind of trying to figure out at the end of this, I appreciated a lot of what he's saying, but then at the end of it, it was kind of like, did he just say nothing? You know what I mean? Because he's like walking this tightrope so finely, and then is eventually just like, because, you know, I was trying to figure out if he was saying, are a lot of these forms, to take Islam, for example, of like what he calls the reactionary medieval utopianism of Islamic fundamentalism, right? Like, is he saying that the origins of Islam as a religion and its ideology have kind of determined a lot of the different historical consequences of like the Muslim world's, I suppose, like their actions and their interactions with the rest of the world? Is he saying that like the ideology has kind of determined a lot of that? Or is he saying that the different religious forms that Islam has taken have served as a kind of like a vessel for these different movements? And he's kind of trying to say both. Maybe we should kind of like get into the specificities of what he's talking about with each of these. Because I think you said it. He brings up the phrase elective affinity. Mm-hmm. And maybe we talk about Christianity first. Because he's basically... Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, go on. Just simply that his discussion of Engels' writings about the peasant rebellions of the sort of like middle and late medieval periods were some of the most interesting parts of this text for me. So
yeah, definitely. Yeah. So we'll start with Christianity. And what he means by elective affinity is he's kind of trying to say that because Christianity, like Jesus times and like Paul the Apostle times was founded, you know, which is to say like
Jesus times.
Yeah, we're talking year one, baby. Like, because that, and, you know, the kind of like Middle Roman Empire, because it was kind of founded as this, you could communistic-esque kind of like religion of the downtrodden, and like, you know, a persecuted sect of people who were, you know, already part of a persecuted sect in the Holy Land, right? Because of that, there's kind of like this, what, you know, an elective affinity. There's an affinity between Christianity at times throughout history and a kind of socialist politics and a kind of like religion of the downtrodden, right? And so this is, you know, it's very obvious when you think about liberation theology. You know, the religion of the downtrodden and kind of like the different writings about suffering that kind of came out of liberation theology. And so he says that there's an elective affinity between original Christianity and the kind of like he calls communistic utopianism. And again, instead of actually talking about liberation theology, he goes into talking about German peasant revolts of the 15th century. But it's the same kind of thing, right? He talks about how these were peasant revolts that necessarily had a Christian character to them because of the time that they were in, because the ideology of the times was so dominated by the church. But also because they were kind of, a lot of these uprisings, though not all of them, were able to latch on to the early kind of like, you know, communistic utopianism of early Christianity as kind of like something that they wanted to go back to. And he also ties in, which I thought was interesting, that a lot of these people were witnessing like the loss of their kind of like village communal Germanic ways of life to kind of like the onset of capitalism and just further exploitation, heightened exploitation by the nobility. And we're kind of like, in a similar way to the Russian Narodniks, like trying to like go back to something new, right? Yeah, I'm interested to know what you make of all this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, well, to begin with, yeah, that there is a similarity he's pointing out between both of these forms of religious inspired protest, whether it's the medieval peasant who has some kind of desire to go back to some kind of idealized form of peasant community life that is being stripped away by the onset of capitalism. And there's a degree to which what he's saying is there is a similar kind of desire amongst adherents of a fundamentalist approach to Islam that wants to go sort of like has a sort of like utopian view of a certain medieval societal form that they want to get back to. One of them being quite reactionary, and one of them being potentially more communalistic. They're both utopian in that they fantasize a world that didn't really fully exist, and as a form of protest against the present world, they sort of look backwards. There is what's quite interesting to me is like he makes this critique of Engels, right? And he's critiquing a youthful Engels who suggests that the medieval peasant, in their sort of like political protest against the political economy, the social structure of medieval life, sort of like dresses up. They use it. He uses this phrase of mask and a flag, sort of like they wear the mask of early Christianity. But what Engels is saying is that politics is motivated by a sort of like a sort of primitive socialist or communist desire that can't fully be realized because the sort of like dialectic of history hasn't fully unfolded yet, and we haven't got to capitalism, which is the necessary component which allows for communism to develop.
Yeah, what idiots.
Yeah. So exactly. Engels in his new atheist phase is critiquing these stupid peasants for not realizing, for being backward looking rather than being progressive and forward looking. He has a phrase for it. I can't remember what it's called, but it's suitably infantilizing of the political desire of the various peasant revolts. What the author of this text does is fill in a lot more of the historical detail that's necessary to understand more fully what's actually happening in the myriad peasant revolts that span like hundreds of years of history. There's constant peasant revolts all the way through the high point and the collapsing phases of feudalism. What the author of this text does is really criticizes and pushes back against Engels' understanding of them simply wearing the garb of utopian Christianity. Engels is sort of saying they couldn't help but interpret the world through religion because that was such a constitutive element of the world in which they lived. It was a necessary religious one. The author of this text says, well, actually, no, there were some peasant revolts that didn't really take on a religious form at all. And there are some that did take on a very religious form. And then he references Thomas Müntzer as his rebellion in Germany as being one of the most progressive, one of the most sort of naturally communistic critiques of feudal society as taking the form of a Christian heresy. Engels is saying that basically all of these peasant revolts took the form of a heresy because they were critical of the Christian world in which they lived, and they looked backwards to an earlier utopian understanding of what Christianity was. The author of this text is saying there's something much more fundamental happening. There are nuances in all of these different protests. the argument that he's trying to make is it's not that the peasant rebel against feudal society who dresses themselves up as a Christian communist is pretending to be a early Christian communist because what they want to do is advance or regress towards some kind of more socialistic form of existence. But no, he's making an argument, the author of this text is making an argument for there actually being an elective affinity, as we've just been saying. There is a natural historical connection. There is a sort of causal mechanism that makes certain types of Christian protest more inclined toward a certain type of affinity to communist society, I guess.
All it takes is for someone to say heresy in something we read, and I'm like, should I get a Sisters Novitiate skill too? That is God telling me to buy more Games Workshop
I mean, we do this every time, right? Every time we encounter medieval religion, we just see it through the lens of the 41st millennium. But
we are subjects of capitalism, Dan. Yes, what else could we do?
Yeah, how can
I
we
should
butt
buy
into
something?
Exactly, yes. How can we but interpret theory in terms of things that we consume?
Exactly. Yeah. Actually, oh God, that's grim. Jesus. I think we should pause really quickly here just to kind of talk about what we talked about when we read the James Connolly stuff about Celtic communism, right? About there's a short discussion here. Short, I literally mean like 2 sentences, where the author kind of mentions that it isn't particularly good to just do what Engels does and be like, this is a reactionary class. It's not the industrial proletariat, therefore it's never going to do communism, right? Like there's no real reason to assume that even these German peasants couldn't have done something like communism. And he mentions the Vera Zasulich letter, right? That Marx sent to Vera Zasulich about when she was like, well, what about the peasant mirror? What about this, people like having communal property still at like, the onset of capitalism? And Marx, like old Marx, was kind of just like, yeah, sure, why not? I don't fucking know. Why not? They seem cool. And I really like the phrase that he uses here. He says, this is basically coming off of him describing, well, I'll just read this bit. He says, in both cases, these were very specific instances of what Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto characterized as reactionary attempts by fractions of the middle class to roll back the wheel of history. However, as Marx would acknowledge many years later in the Russian case, in such instances where commitment to past social forms means preserving collective property, holding back the wheel of history could give, through a spring effect, a powerful impetus for a major leap forward, theoretically at least. Like, yeah, in theory, this could happen. But yeah, again, like there's no reason to turn up your nose and be like, no, everything that isn't, a ripped, muscly male worker in a factory, that has progressive socialist politics, no one else can do do communism, right? Like it has to be the industrial proletariat. There's no reason to think that. And again, you got to work with what you have, like especially politically. So, yeah. We're going to be like the one guy being to the German peasants, like, have you considered exchange value versus use value? But yeah, I like that. The spring effect. That's something that I'll be thinking about, I think, for a while. It's a good phrase.
Yeah, I mean, what a lot of this, maybe it's too soon in the podcast for us to have this discussion, but what a lot of this, we are 45 minutes in, what the hell? What a lot of this made me think about is, well, I sort of made the decision, the realization that I'd much rather have a form of socialism that was born of a sort of Christian desire for a community, well, a communalistic form of life, both socially and economically, that was born out of an understanding of existing within a collective community of believers, I suppose, having that be the binding thing which holds society together. I'd sort of much rather have a form of communism come out of that than a form of communism that comes out of Stalinist atheism by the boot and the mustache, or Richard Dawkins-esque like Enlightenment bomb the Middle East, like
exactly, yeah.
yeah, I don't know. And also, what it made me think about quite a lot of, and this is a discussion for the end of the podcast, probably, is uh, what form a socialist movement might take, and what form a socialist society, what ideological constructs might bind a socialist society together, and in what ways might they be reminiscent of collective religious practice of, I mean, of any religious group, right? But like that sort of thing about like Marxism in some ways being analogous to, or socialism in some ways being analogous to a form of religious worship, or yeah, I don't know.
Well, I think honestly, like, and this will probably get us onto a conversation about fundamentalist Islam, is like, what is it that churches provide for people? Like in America, like fundamentalist churches haven't always been as big as they have been for the last, like, I don't know, 50 years, something like that, right? Like 50, I don't know, 50 to 100 years. Like there was a concerted effort on behalf of like Grover Norquist to shut down all of the union houses and union halls in middle America and basically just replace them with churches, right? Because it's like, back then people used to go hang out at the Union Hall, and that was their hub for community. So when we think, and now they've just been replaced by like, I don't know, my imagination is just like they're all like snake handlers, which is obviously not true, but I think that's very funny to imagine that. It's like you just have to think about what is it that religion provides people, and what can socialism do to fill that void? Because when we talk about liberation theology, the Catholic Church was completely filling the void of a kind of like organized mass left wing movement in a lot of cases, and already had the kind of like infrastructure to have places for people to meet and for people to get to know each other every Sunday, and you hang out and you see your neighbor and you do something other than just fucking go to work and then come home. You know what I mean? Like you actually have community and you have like feasts and stuff like that. Like, and it's a similar thing for fundamentalist Islam. Like radical fundamentalist Islam grew out of the void left of, he calls like the decomposing corpse of any kind of progressive movement in a lot of Muslim countries, right? Um, Obviously, you can look to things like Hamas and Hezbollah, but it's also like it's very obvious for Iran after the Iranian Revolution and after who's the guy that got deposed? Mossadegh. It's like incredibly obvious that, competing foreign powers went in and just completely dismantled anything that existed that was a left-wing movement. And all of a sudden, the only people that are left, even dismantling not just like communist movements, but like middle-class nationalist movements, right? Like you think of like Nasser, who was one of the fundamentalists' biggest enemies, right? Like once all of that is gone and it's been dismantled, the only people who are preaching a anti-Western, anti-imperialist sentiment are these fundamentalist radical groups, because those are the only things that have been allowed to grow or fester kind of in these places, right? Like, it's fairly easy to see kind of very tragically what it is that religion is offering people in a lot of these circumstances. And, Christianity, Islam, like all sorts of different religions, what they're offering people that they don't have. It can be as practical as a place to see other humans that you don't work with on a Sunday, but it can also just be like, I mean, something much more, it's a much more bigger deal, which is like, anti-imperialist organizations, right? Like, it's a bummer.
Mm-hmm.
Lose-lose situation.
Yeah, you've sort of just implicitly brought up an answer to a question of yours that I was going to answer from half an hour ago, which was, is there an unavoidable, is the elective affinity that's being proposed in this essay between Islam and a certain type of reactionary conservatism, utopian conservatism, is that unavoidable? Is it fully determined? Well, there's one fundamental element that has very little to do with the nature of Islam. It's about the sort of like historical intersection between parts of the Middle East and the West, and that sort of like historical political relationship, the one that's necessitated a search for a force which is going to repress any emergence or growth of left-wing movements and tendencies in the Middle East, but also one which is going to promote a form of government which is going to pursue. In some it's different, right? In this essay, he says there are sort of two forms of fundamentalist, sort of like conservative fundamentalist Islam that have developed, one represented by Iran and one represented by Saudi Arabia. And the form that emerges in Saudi Arabia is one which is very conducive toward meeting Western interests, but is supported by the West entirely because of its willingness to take on an autocratic form and be ultra conservative and repressive of any progressive movements, because it sort of like meets Western ends kind of thing. So there's nothing, in some ways, it's fully explained in this text, right? The author of this text is saying that it's through an engagement with the world, it's an engagement with the West, which has contributed very heavily to the state of the state and the nature of the political system in the majority of Middle East countries, Muslim majority countries now.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting. And it's funny when he gets onto the kind of flag and mask stuff, criticizing Engels. I really appreciated what he said about, like, you need to recognize, again, like Marx said, you need to recognize that religion can be used as an oppressive tool, but it also is, you can't just write it off completely like that, because it also is an identity marker of the oppressed. And to be fair, he does give credit to different forms of Islam that have been kind of like progressive institutions in the past. I mean, it's funny because a lot of this didn't necessarily jive with what we read when we were talking about Turkey, the Lauren Goldner piece, because a lot of that was like, Goldner was kind of almost trying to make the point that there was an elective affinity between socialism and Islam, right? But I don't know. We see where that went. I mean, there is a footnote here where he quotes somebody else as talking about the Quran, and he says that, who is this author? Somebody else who's quoted as saying in footnote 19, as saying that the Quranic letter, if submitted to a literal reading, can resonate in the space delimited by the fundamentalist project. It can respond to one who wants to make it talk within the narrowness of these confines, but for it to escape, it needs to be invested with the desire of the interpreter. So he's making an argument that I don't know necessarily how much I agree with, just because I don't know enough about it. He's really coming down on, like, Islam, if left to its own druthers, it seems, is going to be more open to fundamentalist readings than other religions, and especially Christianity, which maybe, but then he also, in the kind of the same breath, is also like, but at the end of the day, the thing that determines all of these is the class struggle. And it's like, oh, okay. You know what I mean? So he's like, it can actually take any form. So I don't really know. I don't know what he's saying, if anything, you know.
Well, there's one thing that I wanted to say, but I might save that for a minute. And maybe what we should talk about is what it is that he's saying about the historical emergence of Islam that he thinks contributes to this elective affinity between Islam and sort of like utopian reactionary politics. He's saying that in stark contrast to early Christianity, which, as you pointed out, like emerged from communities who are sort of marginalized within even further marginalized communities. You know, they were kind of like the totally dispossessed, the totally outsider. They were sort of like led by sort of like the can't remember the phrase that he uses, like some particular way of describing the almost like cult-like nature of the leadership, the sort of like the nature of them, the sort of like Christians as prophets, but also a form of politics which was in a lot of ways kind of millenarian in early Christianity. Like there was this sense that the world was coming to an end, and there was a degree of removing oneself from the day-to-day politics of the state, I guess. The way he describes the emergence of Islam is in stark contrast to that, is as a state building project, as a sort of like martial project that selects military leaders to also be religious ones, and he's saying that that kind of ideology is replete and reproduced throughout many parts of the religious texts of Islam. Now, I haven't read the Quran, I haven't read the Bible. I don't know whether the truthfulness of that, but that's the nature of the argument that he's making. The other point that I wanted to make, and it sort of became apparent to me when I was sort of like talking about Christianity in this sort of like slightly lofty utopian way, which evidently comes from somebody who wasn't raised in any of the mainstream Christian traditions of the 21st century world, right, or the 20th century world, or even the medieval world. Evidently, I wasn't raised within a medieval church, right? But you can. I'm sure there are many people who have been raised within Christianity and found it to be nothing but repressive, doctrinaire, conformist, reactionary, right wing. There are many Christian right wing fundamentalists in the same way that there are Muslim right wing fundamentalists. Also, one of the things that he says in this text, obviously, Christianity ceased to exist in this early communistic, communalistic form and became first the state religion of Rome and then the official state religion of all of Western Europe, and one which formed the foundation and bolstered the sort of like class society of feudal Europe, right? So it's not as if Christianity, nobody's laboring under the misapprehension that Christianity, in the bulk of its existence, has taken the form of rebellious, radical adherence to communism. And the author of this text makes the point that there were many centuries of the existence of both Christianity and Islam in the world where Islam took up the form of being the far more progressive historical force, like, and so clearly that there are other forces at play. Clearly, it's not the case that the Muslim world is incapable of creating states which are progressive, democratic. I don't know, sort of like progressive in the context of the form of class society that exists, is what I'm saying. Like, we're all aware that there were periods of time where the Muslim world was far more knowledgeable about science and mathematics and all sorts of different things. So it's by no means the case that we, or the author in this text, is saying that Islam is somehow backwards and Christianity somehow communist and progressive.
Yeah, I think this is the thing that was kind of that kind of rubbed me the wrong way a little bit about this text, because it's like he brings forward this idea of the elective affinity, but it's like, I don't know, scientifically speaking, it's like, is that just whatever you want it to be? Because it's like when something happens in history where you have a liberation theology or you have a like reactionary Islamic movement, you can be like, oh, well, or like reactionary militant movement, you can be like, well, there's the elective affinity. But then when Christianity, as it has done many times before, is the face of like something horrific and militant, or Islam, conversely, is the face of like being a religion of love, as it is for practically everybody that practices it that isn't using it for a political project, like you go, oh, that's just not the elective affinity. And I definitely see what he's saying, but it's like, I don't know to what it, like, I don't know, to a certain extent, maybe this is just my new atheism coming out again, but it's like religion really is whatever people practicing it want it to be. You can read the Bible and ignore all of the fucked up shit. You can read the Quran and ignore all of the fundamentalist stuff and still call yourself a Christian or a Muslim, right? And so it's like, to what extent does the affinity of these different religions actually weigh on people's minds as they're practicing it? And to what extent, like, I don't know. I guess this just brings us back to Marx, because it's like you have to then stop criticizing the heavens and bring yourself back down to the society that these religions are born into. And then I guess, but then it's like, I don't know, but then what does elective affinity mean? You know what I mean? What, like, I don't know. What relationship does it actually have to the practicing movement? I don't really understand. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I know either. One of the things that's just become I've become very aware of is maybe there is a degree to which this text is very much dated to 2004 kind of thing. Like maybe the arguments that he's making are designed to describe political movements, political and religious movements and states as he is looking at them in the early part of the 21st century, right? Like, that said, there, I think I'm pleased to have been exposed to the arguments that he's making, and I think maybe there is something very useful in identifying things within Islam as a religion which contributed to the formation of the nature of the states, the sort of Muslim majority countries, and how they operate their politics and their state forms now in the 21st century. There is a valuable piece of historical materialist analysis being done in this essay, I think. I think it just comes down to how deterministic one wants to be in one's analysis. And I don't think he's being desperately deterministic. I don't think he's like, he's not saying, and there is X quality which is fundamentally true of this group and not of this group on the grounds of their religious belief. He's definitely not saying that. But
yeah, and I guess maybe I'm like conflating the people practicing the religion with like the different political projects that they get caught up in, and maybe that's his point when he talks about the elective affinity. Like, I don't know. Oftentimes, even in like reactionary, say for example, like Christian projects, there is a kind of populism going on that is based around that kind of like original Christianity of the people. You put a rich man through an eye of a needle kind of stuff. You know what I mean? Like, so yeah, I suppose it's easy to conflate that, but that isn't what he's talking about. And I guess I do need to remember that. The one more footnote, I don't know why I'm reading out all these footnotes, but one interesting thing I thought, which was basically like, it's one sentence and it's basically him summing up how this relates to having a socialist politics. And he says, even on an issue like that of abortion rights, the ideological struggle can be fought without putting into question the spiritual convictions. And I think that's actually like a really useful bit of advice for socialist organizing now. It's not about meeting people halfway, but it's kind of just like about picking your struggles. It's like, you don't need to tell somebody, you worship an old man in the sky, you fool. If you want to be a socialism, you can't do that. It's like, there's no reason for that. And you can call into question the like kind of, sketchy political conclusions that a lot of religions have, for political reasons, whether that's abortion, whether that's LGBT rights, whether that's whatever, right? Like, without hassling people about having a community. You know what I mean? And I think that that's really fair, because there's no point. There's like really no point. You can be religious and be a socialist. It is as simple as that. Like, we would like to see people put, socialism first. And one would imagine that if that happens, they'll be able to find a new community, and one that offers them all of the same things that they find in their religion. At the end of the day, like, just don't hassle people. I think that's kind of his conclusion. It's just like, don't be a dick.
Well, that's always good political advice for sure.
It is. Yeah. It is. Yeah. I'm not sure. Yeah. A lot of people organizing, I'm not sure they really have that. But what are you going to do? The only other thing I'd like to say is that I did think it was interesting where he basically said that both of these religious forms, liberation theology and Islamic fundamentalism, most religions actually, both what they're trying to do is bring heaven to earth, as opposed to criticizing heaven and then criticizing earth. I thought that was a really succinct, good way of putting it, right? Like, whether it's reactionary because they're trying to build, a communistic utopia based on religion or a reactionary medieval utopianism, which that phrase, Tolkien would have been very proud of that phrase. I was reading that. I was
what
like,
was the
wow.
phrase? Medieval reactionary utopianism.
Reactionary medieval utopianism. I was like, that is just the Silmarillion. That's all that is. Like, that is the Lord of the Rings. Brother Tolkien. But yeah, I don't know. I did think that was quite interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting in the sense that like there is an interpretation of state religion which offers sort of like salvation in the afterlife and has very little to say about human beings like present state of existence, right? And so like that but it would make sense if both of these fundamentally like interventionist approaches to religion desire to bring about some kind of, I don't know, religious state on earth, sort of like
He makes a really interesting point where he is like, both socialism and religion promise salvation through themselves, but he was like, while Christianity specifically preaches salvation after death, he's like, socialism is about salvation through transformation of the current society. And I was like, hell yeah. I was like, that rocks. That's really good. One other thing to say too is just a personal anecdote, when I was in, I want to say like middle school or high school or something, one of my best friends was Catholic, and once a month we would go volunteer at a soup kitchen, and it was really cool. It was really fun. It was a soup kitchen for like homeless people, right? And it was really, really fun. But it was at, unsurprisingly, the Catholic Church. And it was like, why was it at the Catholic Church? Because nobody else was doing it. You know what I mean? It's like, so, yeah, it is what it is. Set up new institutions. That's all we're saying. But also, like, I don't know. I wasn't like turning up my nose, like, oh, it's tinged with Catholicism. I don't think I'll be going. What are you gonna do? All right.
Did you I don't know whether to bring this up because I didn't really do the research, but did you read the footnote about this guy? I think his name was Eugene Belfour Bax.
Oh, I did not.
No, the author just refers, like, quotes one of his, like, a seminal text about the peasant revolts, and I was like, oh, this sounds interesting. I better look this guy up. And he was a British, like, social democrat, socialist, quite had a affinity with the left, but also Wikipedia describes him as an early men's rights activist.
Oh no, no.
And it warrants more research. Go out and Google this person, people. Why not? We should go and do it. But like,
scrub my browser history after I look at this guy.
But I was just sort of very confused. I tried to understand the arguments that this guy was making, where there was some kind of like women were somehow in some kind of superior position at the end of the 19th century. But
they're like, please let us vote.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Jesus.
Yeah. So yeah, feminism had gone too far even in 1890.
Jesus. Men's rights activism. What a cursed phrase.
Yeah. But I had no idea it had such a long story. Lurid history.
Yeah, lurid. I remember being legitimately like thrown for a loop when I would like went back and checked in on some of my like new atheist faves and saw that they were just reactionaries. I was like, wait a minute, but what? Huh? How did that happen? And then I was like, oh, okay. It's like this intellectual superiority of like basically
maybe they will always
be
reactionary.
Yeah, exactly. That's the scary part. Exactly.
Yeah.
What are you gonna do? All I know, Dan, is that evolution is determined entirely by the selfish gene. That's all.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I mean also that. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Dear.
Great.
Well, all right.
Good.
That's it.
Yeah, we've done it.
We've done it. Lovely.
We got there.
We got there. Next
another
episode.
Fine episode.
Yeah, another
episode
fine
99
episode.
in the bag.
In the bag. Next episode 100. Expect something huge.
Oh, no,
we did this about something. I feel like it was like episode 50 or something where we built it up for a really long time and then we just did nothing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yes. The listener can be reassured that we similarly likely of having nothing special in the bag.
Yeah, exactly.
Who knows?
Well.
Maybe it'll be great. Maybe we'll read some men's rights activism.
Yeah. Or better yet, we'll read State and Revolution,
Yes.
like we've always been
Like
promising.
we've always said we will.
We did like 70 episodes ago. We both bought, I think you already had it, but I got, because we were going to read it for the show, the Erfurt program. It was never did.
Okay,
Yeah.
2 weeks.
2 weeks, get through the Erfurt program and sound like you know what you're talking about.
Well, we'll come up with something. Rest assured.
There'll be an episode.
We'll come up with something.
Yeah.
We might just skip
normal.
100. We might skip right to 101.
That would fix things because we actually, it will, like since we did an introduction episode.
Oh,
this is episode 100.
This
technically,
is
that's not the
100.
number. So that would actually fix things. We just skipped it, but what are you gonna do? No, it wouldn't, because then we just go to 101 free. Or would it fix? I don't know.
I don't know.
I took a philosophy class in college for my math credit. I don't know what I'm talking about.
Wow.
Cool. All right. I was too busy hassling religious people on the internet to understand math.
God's work. You were doing God's work.
Indeed. I'm going to go do a COVID test, Dan. I don't think I have COVID, but unless you've given it to me over the internet.
Over the internet. Yeah.
We'll see.
Well, I'm not going to do a COVID test. I'm just going to keep telling people I have COVID regardless.
Yeah, for the next 3 weeks.
Yeah,
I just got COVID. Sorry.
I feel like I'm done with COVID tests. And
yeah, they suck. Work, like, actually, in a stunningly cool move, gave me like 14 free tests. It basically, it was
then you
like,
check the sell-by date, and it's like,
actually, though, it was like 2 weeks. It's like, what am I going to do? A test a day? Like, it's like, yeah. To be fair, that was because they were like, you're going to be around a lot of people. So it's just like,
for a particular period of time. Okay.
Yeah, and it was like, or I could just not.
Yeah.
But yeah, whatever.
Yeah, you're going to be in contact with a lot of snotty students in the next few weeks.
Bastards. Yeah, exactly. What are you gonna do? Well, I do my best to hide. I've gotten very good at hiding. If you ever want to learn how to hide at a job, get a job in a warehouse and then get an office job. It's so much easier to fucking hide at an office job. What are you gonna do? Anyways, okay.
Yeah. That can be episode 100.
That
all our top tips for
how to
shirking work. Slacking off.
That's socialist practices. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dan.
Yes.
See you later. Get some sleep, please.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
The music you heard this episode was Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. If you like this song, you can check it out and much, much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. Be sure and follow us up on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And if you like what you heard, be sure and tune in next week for some more commie discussion. Till next time.